We kind of played on the idea of God is at work through the atheist because he's the one over there pointing out, hey, look at what you people are doing and that sort of thing.
Oh, the agnostic, yeah.
Yeah, but what I want to know is some people would look at this and they would applaud what you're writing about because it needed to be said, somebody needs to talk about the obsessiveness of the religious fanatic and that sort of thing. However, they would say, but to submit your mind to any kind of a higher power, whether it's God or a 12-step program or whatever, is to abdicate some responsibility, to abdicate at least a little bit of thinking for yourself. And your book is called When God Becomes a Drug. Some skeptics may ask the question, when is God not a drug? How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I mean, they would generally be right. The most religion has been abusive. Most religion has been patriarchal. Most religion has been with almost a caste system of bishops and priests and ministers and pastors, and then maybe church wardens and vestry people, and then it goes down. So there's a system, a tier system. But they've always been spiritual people, if you talk about spiritual people, who've talked about empowerment of the people. They've always been like the Jesuit Terre de Chardin, who talks about being co-creators with God. There's always been, Mahatma Gandhi, who's a Hindu but religious, who basically talked about the need to share power, democracy. And I suppose always in life you've had religious people who are very healthy, who've talked about sharing, that God doesn't kind of come through a pyramid system of power, that it's much more expansive for all of us, more like a circle. The Native Americans talk about the medicine circle, medicine wheel, but the circle is more democratic. The pyramid is hierarchical. That's dangerous. But when you said to me, let's talk about spirituality, I was talking about how don't believe your own press, how religious people, if you see, one of the most spiritual things is to realize you're not God. One of the most spiritual things is to realize you don't have all the answers. One of the most spiritual things is that no religion or denomination has all the answers. So the more you can have dialogue and discussion, and the more you can start have diversity and find out what people believe. And also, maybe you have different aspects of worship, different times in your life. You know, a bit like clothes. I don't know about you, but sometimes I like to wear a t-shirt and jeans, and then other times I like a suit, and other times I like to be, a sports jacket and, a t-shirt like you have on, a polo neck or something. In other words, fashion is varied. You'd be a very dull person if you wear the same clothes all the time. You'd be a very dull person if you just eat hamburger and French fries every day. So you mix it. Chinese, Indian, Thai, American, not English. Don't never eat English if you want to survive. But I mean, everybody has a variety, right? Why is it so? I've always said this. Why can't you have variety in religion, worship? And I think that there should be, like my church, St. George's Episcopal Church in Hawthorne. We have gay people, we have straight people, we have a spirituality service once a month, which is really kind of non-religious, more spiritual. And we have regular Sunday services at 10 o'clock, like the Mass, just like a Roman Catholic Mass, except it's Episcopal. But there's it has a form and a ceremony. And my point with it is give people choices. The more choices you give them, the more they're going to be fed. Yeah. So I think that's, and I'll say this, I know we're running towards the end of the show, but a spiritual person doesn't have to believe in God. So, you see, you've not got to, religious people believe in God usually. You know, I mean, a religious person normally believes in God, whether he's Jewish or Muslim. But a religious person believes in God. But a spiritual person, a spiritual poet, artist, dancer, writer, they may have spiritual values of integrity, honesty, freedom, liberty, but they may not be religious. They may not believe in God.
I've never heard that. Actually, this is kind of the first time that I've heard it explained to me that a person who does not believe in God can have a spirituality, because so often when I have heard about spirituality, it's always in connection with a supreme being or God or some kind of another world.
No, Aldous, the Huxley family, who were agnostic, and others. I mean, you know, some of the most famous atheists in the world were very noble men and women. I mean, you know, I mean, they're not crazies, selfish. In fact, the opposite. They very often lived their life, endured a lot of criticism and hardship, but they just didn't believe in religion, and they didn't believe in a God. But they believed in humanitarian values.
You know, most religious addicts probably don't, there's no probably about this. I mean, they don't recognize themselves as religious addicts a lot of times.
Well, some do, but most don't. You're right, most don't. Most people don't.
And well, sometimes the people who maybe they recognize themselves as religious addicts without, say, an intervention of some kind, they generally, and there are exceptions to this, but generally it's always because some tragedy happened or whatever, and they now have to look inward and figure out, well, it's because of my religion, or maybe if I hadn't have, say, gone to church and looked after my ill wife here, maybe she would be alive or something like that, you know. When we see somebody, whether they be family members or whatever, who are religious addicts, how can we help them without necessarily making them think that we're trying to force our views down their throats, so to speak?
Yeah, you don't do that, because then you're just doing what they do.
Yes.
But I think that one of the things you don't do is keep swapping scripture, because that isn't going to get you anywhere. All you do is feed their addiction, because they're very good at quoting scripture. So you don't get into the game of scripture quoting. I tell you one of the things that works more than anything, okay, and that is talk about how what they're saying makes you feel. So you say, when I hear you say what you've just said about gay and lesbians, that makes me feel very sad, very depressed, very hurt that you could be so judgmental. So in other words, keep going to how it makes you feel. When you speak like this, you make me feel very angry.
So then if they were to counter you with something like, well, I'm sorry if it makes you feel this way, but that's what God says in His Word, what would you then do? I mean, you mentioned that you wouldn't go scripture quoting or anything like that.
What I would say is that I feel differently about God. Would you like to listen to how I feel about God? Would you like to hear what I feel God is saying to me today? Would you like to hear that? And if they say, no, I wouldn't want to hear that if you want to know the truth, everything that is in the Bible, after a while they catch themselves. You know, have you ever caught yourself losing your temper, and you know you're losing your temper, and you know you're not behaving very well, but you're into the drama?
Right.
Have you ever done that?
Oh, yes.
I do that sometimes. And I think to myself, God, this is me, and I wish I wasn't doing this. I think they're the same. Okay? So I think that what you want to do is to get it so that they start catching themselves, and maybe they do a second think. In other words, that wasn't really very, they're talking now to themselves. That wasn't very Christian of me, was it? Telling them to shut up, or I don't want to listen to what they want to say, or everything's out of the Bible. They catch themselves. And I think alcoholics catch themselves sometimes, and they feel very sad about the way they've treated people. And I think sometimes controlling people know they're controlling, and they don't like that part of themselves. And I think more and more, if you can be a caring, loving person who basically says, look, you can believe what you believe, but let me share with you what I believe. How rude of you to sit there and tell me everything that you believe, but you won't allow me to share with you what I believe. And you catch them off the guard. See, the problem with, if I may say so before we end the show, the problem with many humanists or many people who are atheists is they become almost as religious in not believing as the religious people are in believing. So they form their own little groups of non-believing people. And they all meet and have coffee and they all get together and they're critical of churches. You know what I mean? And they have their particular A-list of clergymen that they hate. And they all sit around and criticize them. Just like the clergy criticize them. But all I'm saying is you've fallen into the same game.
Oh yeah, I've fallen into that myself. I mean, I kind of enjoy.
Really, Dwayne?
Oh yes, yes. Oh, I've been on both extremes here, from Bob Jones University to the humanists. I mean, you know, so interesting little segue there. But it's fun to look at, say, the scriptures that they give, and then just, you know, find out just what the Bible really says about certain things, and then go back and forth and then do original languages and all that. But you're right, when you are faced with a person who really believes this stuff, ultimately all this arguing about scripture gets you nowhere. The main thing that, you know, you should probably put the emphasis on is, why does this person believe what they believe? Not what do they believe, but why do they believe?
And in most cases you're going to find that they come from some kind of dysfunction or abuse.
Yeah.
And because if they need religion that much, it becomes almost like a crutch, a drug. You know, because they can't live in reality. They can't live with the real world. And the real world is, there's black and white, there's gay and straight, there's married and single, there's religious people, and there's non-religious people. That's the real world.
I knew a person who had an interesting method of dealing with people who would try to bait him in arguments. And basically what he would do is he would agree with them on a certain point, and then he would pick, say, a common scapegoat, for instance, like the Catholic Church. You know, wasn't it terrible what the Catholics do? Everybody's there, they just follow the Pope blindly, and they don't quite think for themselves, da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, but your church isn't like that, is it? I mean, you don't follow the pastor blindly and all that kind of stuff. And it would be, you know, various examples like that to get them to at least look into themselves and to look onto their church. Background and church history.
I think so. I think more and more, you know, we have, maybe we should say this before we end, we have a support group for religious abuse at St. George's. It meets on a Monday night. And many people who've been victims, either sexually abused by pastors or priests, or came from very rigid Catholic or Protestant backgrounds. They meet to share their experience. And the wonderful healing is not some magic, but just being able in a safe place to talk about what it was like to grow up in a rigid, abusive, guilt-ridden church or group.
Right. Let's mention the name of your church. That was
St. George's.
St. George.
St. George's Episcopal Church. It's on El Segundo Boulevard. Did you put the 800 number up?
Yes, there will be an 800 number after this.
Okay, if they call that 800 number, then they can get information on how to get to the church. And there's a support group every Monday night at 7 o'clock.
Well, there you go. And if this is something that you think you need to deal with or know with someone, give them a call and show up. I'd like to thank you for being with us here. This was certainly an enlightening program that we did. I'd like to thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Mars Hill.